You're listening to On Shifting Ground. I'm Ray Suarez. At the time of this recording, two countries are in the midst of wars dominating the headlines. We've followed the conflict in Ukraine since Russian troops invaded over a year ago, and in mid-April, Sudan was plunged into civil war. It's anyone's guess how both will end. But there are journalists documenting what's going on in these conflict zones, and they're putting their lives on the line. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, 67 international media workers were killed in the field in 2022. That number doubled from the previous year, largely due to the war in Ukraine. And in March 2023, Wall Street Journal reporter Evan Gershkovich was detained by Russia's Federal Security Services under suspicion of espionage. The arrest marked the first time an American journalist has been charged for spying in Russia since the Cold War. How can we better protect journalists who are under threat abroad? And why does their safety matter to the health of a free press? I'm joined now by Gulnoza Said. She's the Europe and Central Asia Program Coordinator for the Committee to Protect Journalists, an organization devoted to protecting the lives and well-being of reporters around the world and safeguarding their freedom to work. Welcome to On Shifting Ground.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Who is Evan Gershkovich, and what should listeners know about his work and his background?
Evan Gershkovich is an American journalist who, until recently, worked in Russia for the Wall Street Journal, and he was detained on March 29, and the following day he was charged with espionage. He is the first American journalist to be charged with espionage since 1982, since practically the Cold War. And it's one of the biggest press freedom cases for us at CPJ because of the seriousness of the charges.
What reason has the Russian government given for Gershkovich's detention?
Well, Russian authorities don't usually give reasons or explanations when they detain journalists, which is a very widely used practice because their goal is to silence independent voices, and that's exactly the real reason behind Gershkovich's arrest. And because he's charged with espionage, we're not likely to know the details of the case. He's got two lawyers. Those lawyers had to sign non-disclosure agreements, so they cannot even speak to colleagues or family of Evan about the details of the case and the charges.
So even in court under the Russian system, we won't hear, the world won't hear what it is the government alleges he did in order to justify a charge of espionage?
The lawyers will hear that, but you and I and many Russians won't be allowed to a courtroom because these kind of trials are held behind closed doors and very little details are usually known about the charges.
Was there the equivalent of an arraignment? Has Gershkovich been seen publicly? Did he appear in court before a magistrate? Were the charges pronounced? What are the ins and outs of the Russian system in a case like this?
Well, the first time he was detained, the court heard the charges and decided to hold him in detention until May 29th. And usually that's the practice, 2 months while the investigators are conducting the investigation. And then earlier this week, he appeared in a courtroom again because his lawyers appealed against the detention itself, not against the charges, because for the time being they can't do that, but against the detention. And what they wanted is for Evan to be released either under house arrest or on bail. And the Russian court refused because of the seriousness of the charges. As I said, espionage charges are considered very serious, and defendants and suspects are usually held in a strict security detention centers.
How's he holding up? Do we know? Has he been able to speak to anybody who can then either speak to CPJ or the authorities at the Wall Street Journal or to the State Department about how he's being treated in custody?
Well, he's been able to speak to his lawyers, and also finally the US ambassador and members of the consulate in Moscow were able to visit him in detention, and they also saw him in the courtroom. And he said that he was fine, healthy, and he was exercising and trying to write fiction, not nonfiction, not journalistic materials, because obviously that could be used against him. You never know with Russians. And he was also able to send a quick note written in Russian, and he is able to receive letters. And the Wall Street Journal organized a campaign so everyone can send a letter to Evan in detention. Those letters have to be physical letters, like printed on paper and written in Russian. So the Wall Street Journal organized the translation of those letters, and we are in touch with the journal all the time.
What's different or similar about Gershkovich's case from previously detained journalists? Russians arrest journalists all the time. Is the prominence of his publication unusual? Is the international access of his organization unusual? And why the particular charge of espionage, as opposed to the many other things the Russians can accuse journalists of doing?
Well, the answer to your last question is something only Russian authorities can give, probably Putin, because as far as we understood from the reports, Putin had been made aware of the case before Gershkovich was detained, and he sort of approved the detention and the charges. So the instructions came from the highest level in Russia. I don't know why the espionage charges. I can't say that. But he is definitely a very prominent journalist who has been covering stories that the Russian authorities didn't want to be covered. They have been trying to silence journalists in Russia for decades, but especially after Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. Evan wrote about Putin's circle. He wrote about the impact of the Western sanctions on the Russian economy, and he spoke to ordinary Russians, asking them questions about how their lives has changed since the sanctions were introduced. He also traveled to neighboring countries like Kazakhstan and Georgia and spoke to a lot of anti-war Russians who relocated to those countries after the full-scale invasion. So those were exactly the stories that the Russian authorities, including Putin, didn't want to be published, and their goal from this case is to silence him.
It's been widely reported outside Russia that there are all kinds of restrictions on what you can legally call the invasion of Ukraine, what to call the war there. Has it meant new challenges, a new set of obstacles to be navigated for reporters working inside Russia? In the last 14 months, have you had to be much more careful about what you said and how you said it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. After the February 24th, 2022, we saw quite a few independent media outlets condemning the war. But then a few days later, the Russian legislature amended the laws and made it practically illegal to call the war a war and to use the word occupation, for example, and they instructed all media to describe the conflict in Ukraine as a special military operation. And anybody who dared to still describe the conflict as the war, which it is, was under the risk of being prosecuted criminally on charges of distributing fakes. So what happened is that a lot of journalists fled Russia. A lot of Russian journalists fled Russia. A lot of foreign correspondents initially relocated from Russia elsewhere because they wanted to see how the law would impact them, foreign press corps. Some of them went back, including Evan, and continued reporting. And there was this hope that if the Russian authorities wanted to persecute them, that the ways to do so would not be as serious as the charge of espionage. So that's why I'm saying that Evan's case is the most serious and prominent one, and also it was quite unexpected. Not the prosecution of an American journalist or a foreign journalist in general, but the charges were quite surprising for me.
Have there been either harassments or detentions or charges against foreign journalists working for media outlets in other countries? Naturally, we hear a lot about Evan Gershkovich here in the United States because he works for the Wall Street Journal. Are there French or Egyptian or Turkish or any other journalists who have been under state sanction in a similar way since the war began?
Local journalists have obviously been more vulnerable to repressions of the Russian authorities. And as I said, many of them, probably hundreds, have fled, but many have been in Russian jails. When we at CPJ conducted our most recent prison census in December 2022, there were 19 journalists in Russian jails, and that's the highest number ever since we at CPJ started keeping record in 1992. As to foreign correspondents, yes, we have seen cases when their accreditations were not renewed or visas were not renewed, so they had to go back to their home countries. And even before the full-scale invasion, we have seen cases, and we documented the cases of journalists, including Americans or those who had dual American and Russian citizenship, who were harassed and persecuted, but not charged with espionage.
How does CPJ handle itself in a case like this? Naturally, normally, you don't want to be perceived as being in partnership with a government. But certainly the United States government is implicated when one of its citizens is arrested abroad. How do you handle yourself? Have you been in communication with the State Department, with the United States government, with the Wall Street Journal? Is it part of CPJ's toolkit to jump into action and talk to everybody?
You pointed out it very correctly that CPJ is a non-governmental organization, and we are not part of any government, and we don't receive any funds from any government in the world. So even if it is an intergovernmental organization that's organizing a conference and invites me, CPJ would pay for my tickets and hotel. We are that strict in those ethical terms. And when it comes to advocacy, we do advocacy with governments in many different countries around the world, including the United States. What is different in this case is probably the very fact that Evan Gershkovich is the U.S. citizen. But other than that, I think we are working with them as we would with any other governments if a journalist from any other country was detained.
What has the Wall Street Journal had to say since the arrest?
Well, the Wall Street Journal is very supportive of Evan Gershkovich. They, from the start, said that the charges were fabricated and that Evan Gershkovich is being punished for his reporting. They also lifted the paywall, and now anybody can read articles written by Evan Gershkovich, so everybody can see that what he was doing in Russia was indeed journalism. Also, as I mentioned, they organized this campaign with the hashtag I Stand With Evan and Free Evan Gershkovich. And also one can write an email to Evan, which they would translate to Russian and send a printed copy to Evan in the Russian detention. As far as I understand, they're also doing advocacy with the United States authorities.
It's hard to understand at first glance what the Russians gain from this. I mean, we're not going to find out less about Russia because one man has been detained. But longer term, if Russia is looking at this as part of a long game, does it send a chill through the entire foreign press corps? Does it make people more cautious about what they write? Does it make international organizations less likely to cover Russia fearlessly and forthrightly? Can the Russians sort of strategize around this, taking down somebody from a prominent international organization and saying, this is a shot at everybody who does this work. Watch yourself.
Send a chilling message to other foreign correspondents working in Russia? Definitely yes. And I know of journalists who started considering leaving Russia, and a foreign photographer who was working with Evan on his most recent story, unfinished story, decided to flee Russia. So eventually, this is the first very prominent case, but there could be the next, and nobody is immune from repressions. Now it is very clear. And what is also clear is that the charges are likely to be very serious, especially if you come from a country that's been critical of Russia and Russian invasion of Ukraine and has been supportive of Ukraine and providing Ukraine with aid, like the United States. So eventually, also, one aspect that you didn't touch on your question is that journalists like Evan also provided a platform for many Russians to be heard. And what is going to happen now after those ordinary Russians watch Russian TV and hear about an American journalist who turned out to be a spy, well, if you repeat the official narrative in Russia, then they're going to probably think twice before they speak to another foreign correspondent, even if that person comes and shows their accreditation with the foreign ministry and says, I'm a foreign journalist. They're going to be very careful. And that's the worst part, because there are fewer and fewer platforms for the ordinary Russians to speak out, to say anything critical of the authorities, and for us, you and me and the rest of the world, to know what exactly is going on the ground in Russia.
Along with the Committee to Protect Journalists, others have fiercely denounced the Gershkovich arrest. For example, Jason Rezaian, who, as Washington Post Tehran bureau chief, was held in Evin prison for over a year, says stop calling him under arrest. Stop calling him a suspect. Call him what he is, a hostage, someone who's been taken by a foreign government for reasons quite apart from any serious legal case against them. Do you agree with that nomenclature? Is it right to call Evan Gershkovich a hostage, as Jason Rezaian suggests we do?
Absolutely. And Jason knows it. The hostage policies of some autocratic states like Iran and Russia. And I agree that Evan Gershkovich is a hostage of the Russian state. In recent years, what we've seen is that it was state actors rather than non-state actors who took journalists hostage. And journalists held in detention in Russia are exactly hostage of the regime because they did nothing wrong but exercised their freedom of speech, but were punished for it. And Evan Gershkovich is not just a hostage, but he is also a bargaining chip. Russia is going to try to get as much benefit from this case as possible in its negotiations with the West.
Now, people may be more familiar with violence against journalists in countries like Mexico or Libya or Syria. Can you give us an overview of sort of the state of play in your program area? You're the director for Europe and Central Asia. How are press freedoms looking in your area of responsibility?
Well, I cover a lot of countries, more than 50 countries. Among them are the world's worst jailers of journalists, like Turkey, Belarus, Russia, Tajikistan, with dozens of journalists being held behind bars for their reporting that the authorities in their countries didn't like. Russia has also seen one of the highest numbers of journalists killed in direct retaliation for their work, especially under Putin. Since we at CPJ started keeping record in 1992, more than 80 journalists have been killed. 38 of them were murders, contract-style murders, including one of an American journalist, by the way. And only in 2 of those cases full justice has been achieved. So Russia has had a dire press freedom record even before Evan Gershkovich's case. So has Turkey, and I already mentioned Belarus, which held at least 26 journalists behind bars when we did our prison census in December, and it was the 5th largest jailer of journalists in the world. It was never easy to work as a journalist in Belarus, but after the contested presidential elections of 2020 and mass detentions of protesters, if you remember, the authorities have been not just detaining journalists, but bringing very serious charges of extremism against them. There are a lot of journalists who don't get necessary medical treatment in Belarusian jails. It's very difficult to do advocacy on Belarus because the authorities in Belarus are not listening to anybody except for Russia, and Russia itself has a dire press freedom and human rights situation. And last year, Ukraine was obviously one of the top countries where a lot of journalists were killed in the conflict. We documented 15 cases. At least 13 of them were killed while news gathering and reporting, and there were local journalists and foreign journalists among them. And Central Asia has never been free. I already mentioned Tajikistan, which has at least 7 journalists jailed behind bars and is the top jailer of journalists in the region of Central Asia. But in other countries of the region, the situation also has been dire for decades, ever since these countries became independent after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So, to tell you the truth, this is a very difficult and challenging region to cover if you work in press freedom like I do.
What can members of the general public do? If you're sitting at home and listening to our conversation, if you value not only the freedom to cover the news here in the United States, but to cover it around the world, both for foreign audiences and for domestic audiences, you might be thinking, well, I wish I could do something, but I'm just a reader, I'm just a listener, I'm just a viewer. What can I do? Are people powerless? Is there something they can actually do that's practical, helpful, important?
Well, people are not powerless, definitely not in the United States, because we see a lot of people helping us by donating to us so we can keep going and helping journalists. As you know, we provide financial grants to journalists in emergency situations. That's one way of helping. Obviously, help journalists themselves by reading their articles, clicking on their articles, watching their broadcasts and such. There are ways to help journalists through various means, and a lot of journalists need your help. This morning, I spoke to 2 Ukrainian journalists. One of them is in Kharkiv, and she lived under occupation for 4 months, and her home city was under occupation for 6 months in total. And another one is originally from Mariupol, and he had to flee to a safer area of Ukraine. Both of them continue working, and one of them is a chief editor of a newspaper. And because there are problems with electricity and the internet, people started reading newspapers. And she doesn't cover the war itself, but covers very basic news, like where volunteers can volunteer, what kind of work to do, when there will be power cutoffs and things like that, very practical information that everybody needs. I'm used to talking to people in difficult situations, to journalists, but listening to their stories broke my heart because they were 2 of so many Ukrainian journalists who continue working despite all the difficulties, amidst the sirens, amidst shelling and bombing. Those who want to help can help. Ukrainian media, Belarusian media, exiled Russian media, many media outlets, and the press freedom organizations like CPJ.
You are based in New York, but you're a citizen of Uzbekistan. You're from Uzbekistan. I understand that when you tried to go home recently, they didn't let you in. Tell us about it.
Yes. I'm originally from Uzbekistan, and I worked for an American media outlet. The first report I filed was in the fall of 2000, so 22 and a half years ago. That was for an American media outlet. And I reported on Uzbekistan and on Central Asia and surrounding countries for many years, and I was persecuted in Uzbekistan. I was charged with libel and defamation and threatened to be charged with espionage and a long conviction and a long prison sentence. And I had to flee my country, and I wasn't able to visit Uzbekistan for 9 years until presidents changed. And yeah, last year, this incident happened when they held me at the Tashkent airport for 7 hours before they finally let me in. I'm now an American citizen. I came to the United States from Uzbekistan, and the old authorities of Uzbekistan stripped me of the Uzbek citizenship. So I'm not an Uzbek citizen anymore. I don't know. No explanation was given. I hope to be able to visit Uzbekistan because my elderly parents live there, my siblings live there, and I just want to be able to visit the country where I was born. But I don't know. I guess I have to try and travel and see what happens.
Well, Gulnoza Said, it was a pleasure speaking to you, and thanks for both the practical and the idealistic case for a world of press freedom. It is so important for people to value and protect the ability to work of journalists not only where they live and where they listen and consume news, but all over the world. It's essential for freedom. And thanks a lot to you and for the work of the Committee to Protect Journalists.
Thank you. Thank you, Ray. Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced by Elise Manukian, Sienna Barnes, and Andrew Stelzer. It was mixed and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is CEO of World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.